Hi everybody, this is Bob Remedi, biology professor at College of Lake County.
I'm Jason Cashmore, also a bio instructor at CLC. But I think we're lost, Bob. I thought we were doing a forest lab today.
Jason, you got your waders on. We're not in the forest. We're at Willow Lake and the campus of College of Lake County, and we're here to talk today about lake and pond assessment.
That sounds like fun.
Come on,
Let's do that.
let's go. So here we are, right in the water here at Willow Lake, and I want to tell you a little bit about the difference between the different types of wetlands. So we mentioned before in a previous video that a wetland is a wet land. So it is property that has water on it. But there's more than just the fact that there is standing water, although that can certainly be one of the characteristics. Second thing we see is the presence of hydrophytes. Hydrophytes are plants that grow specifically in wetland environments. And when we think of hydrophytes, typically the things we think about are cattails and duckweed living in the water and such. And then the third characteristic of a wetland is that the soil has water among the particles, what we call hydric soil. And what that means is sometimes you can have a wetland that doesn't have standing water, but if there's enough water in the soil particles, it still qualifies as a wetland. So here we are at Willow Lake. What makes a lake different from a pond, different from the other types of wetlands? So a lake is a wetland with standing water, and it is deep enough so that you don't have plants that are rooted in it. Okay, and what that gives you is a zone where the water is deep enough that light can't reach the bottom. Okay, now this differs from a pond in that a pond generally is smaller, but not always. Generally, the idea of a pond is that it's 20 acres or less. But a pond is shallow enough so that you have rooted aquatic plants going all the way across. And these differ from the other wetlands that we've talked about in terms of the bog, which has acidic water, and bog plants like the sphagnum moss and the tamarack tree, and marshes, which have standing water but have 80% or more herbaceous plants like cattails growing.
Okay, so what I've got here is a benthic sampling net, which is commonly called a D-net. I don't know why it's called a D-net. That's like a backwards D, but who comes up with this stuff? I don't know. So the way that this works is it is flat on the bottom so that you can sample along the bottom and not worry about organisms getting by you. If it were rounded on the bottom of the net, we wouldn't be able to put it flat on the bottom of the pond, which is also called the benthos or the benthic zone. Hence, this is a benthic sampling net. So these are very commonly used in streams, in flowing waters. And when you're in a flowing water situation and you want to sample an area, what you do is stand upstream of it. So if I want to stand right there, the water would be flowing this way. I would put the net down flat on the bottom, and then I would just use my feet to kick up the rocks or gravel or sticks or whatever is in the area that I want to sample. I would just kind of gently disturb it. And what happens is the current just pushes anything that I've kicked up into the net. And then when I've adequately kind of, kicked up that area, then I pull it up and I've got my sample in there. This is a pond. Ponds do not have flowing water, so obviously that's not going to work for us. So a couple of things to keep in mind when you're using a D-net in not flowing water is, one, you have to keep the net moving, because if you stop, stuff can obviously swim out of the net. So you want to keep it moving until you've scooped up out of the water. Two, you want to keep it as tight to the bottom as you can. You don't want to dig in, because some areas here have solid bottom, other areas are pretty mucky. And if I were to really dig in, I would just get a net full of sediment and muck, and it's probably anaerobic. There's probably no oxygen in there, and it would stink when I scooped it up. So I want to be careful that that doesn't happen. Plus, there's nothing in there, so I really wouldn't get any specimens in my sample. What we're really looking for with this type of net is aquatic invertebrates. So insects, insect larvae, things like dragonflies and mayflies and damselflies, where the adults are flying, but the larvae live in the water. things like amphipods, isopods, so a lot of aquatic invertebrates. That's really what we're targeting with this. So let me try to take a sample and see if I follow the instructions that I just gave you. All right, so not too muddy, but what I always recommend once you've got your sample is you can rinse it off like this, just in case there is some mud or anything in there. And then I can never resist taking a quick look. Looks like we do have some stuff in here, so let's get this in a tray and take a closer look. So now that we have our sample, we're going to put it on this tray so that we can pick through and find any organisms that we've caught. So the best thing to do is to get a good amount of water in the tray. Sometimes people try to keep it too dry, and that's just not going to work. So I've got a fair amount of water in there. I'm going to set this jar right here for any cool stuff that I catch. And in goes our sample, which has some giant sticks in it that don't want to go. So usually it would go a lot smoother than this. Okay, we dump our sample in. I like to really, ooh, look at that. I like to really drape it in the water because the organisms are aquatic. They don't want to be on something like this. They'd rather be in the water. So when I touch it to the water, they feel that and they want to let go. So using some really sophisticated sampling equipment, I've got a plastic spoon here and some plastic tweezers here, I'm just going to go through and look for anything that's moving. And if I can, I'm going to remove some of this bigger stuff just because that's got a snail on it, so I want to get the snail. Otherwise that has nothing else on it. And I usually go for the bigger stuff first, or just the faster stuff that's moving around the most. So here's something, put that into my sample jar. Here's another organism there. Here's that first one that I saw. This is a very large organism, so we want that. And then you slowly start moving on to smaller and smaller things. But again, I think the key is to look for movement. So I see sometimes there's so many things moving, I have a hard time picking. Got that guy. Here's another one. And then anytime you don't see movement anymore, what you can do is come into where there's a lot of, sticks and decaying leaves and things, and just kind of gently stir it up a little bit. And if there are any organisms in there, they'll come swimming out. Like this guy, he was sitting there really still, but when I disturbed that material that he was hiding on, he came swimming out. So you just kind of keep doing that until nothing comes swimming out, and then you've found everything there is to be found in that sample. Oh, that looks pretty good. So once you feel like you've searched through the sample enough, you dump it into the pond. You're sure to miss some things, so you don't want to dump this on the ground, because then anything that was in there that you didn't find is going to die on the dry ground. So we want to make sure we dump that back into the pond, and then get another sample, do it again. Okay, so here is some of what we caught with the benthic sampling net. You can see there's some organisms swimming around. So I'm going to scoop them up one by one and talk about them. These guys right here are called amphipods. Amphipods are a type of crustacean, so they're related to shrimp, crayfish, lobster, things like that. Whereas a lot of other crustaceans are flattened dorsally, so kind of they're squished from the top down. These are flattened laterally, so from the sides they're squished inwards. Another, or a common name for these is scuds. I've never liked that. This is a beautiful specimen of a damselfly. Damselfly are in the order Odonata with the dragonflies, and they're predatory. And the adults are terrestrial. They don't live in the water. They fly around and they feed on mosquitoes, flies, smaller insects, so they're good to have around. The juvenile forms, though, are aquatic. They live in the water. They have gills. A lot of students will mistake the damselfly larvae with mayfly larvae because they have 3 structures off the tip of the abdomen. In mayflies, those are just bristly structures, whereas in damselflies, those are actually the gills, and they're kind of feathery, and this one really has nice big ones. I don't know if they're showing up very well. And odonates, both damselflies and mayflies, have really neat mouth parts that fold up underneath their head, and when they see a prey organism, they extend out and they grab it. They're really neat predators.
Here's a picture of one right here. This is from a dragonfly.
What else do we have here? So there's a ton of water boatmen here. A bunch of them are smaller. Let me see if I can scoop up a bunch. There's 4 water boatmen with some sort of bonus thing. Not quite sure what that is. I would need to look at that under the microscope to get a better look at it. It's squiggling really similar to how a mosquito larvae would, but it doesn't have the breathing tube that a mosquito larvae would, so I'm not sure if it is. But these other 4 guys are water boatmen, and you can see they have these, they're a type of insect, so they have 3 pairs of appendages, and the front pair of appendages are really long, and the outer end of them is flattened, almost like oars that stick out on either side of a boat, and they can propel themselves around really fast with those. And I caught a lot of these today, mostly this small size, but that's a bigger one than the others. Actually, there we go. What else do we have? Oh, we've got some predaceous diving beetles. This is an aquatic beetle. Similar to the water boatmen that have the front pair of legs that are shaped like oars, the back pair of legs on the predaceous diving beetles are shaped like oars. And so they are very fast swimmers. They also, as an adult beetle, they have wings and they can fly. So if water conditions get bad, they can fly to a new location. Here's a mayfly. Mayflies are in the phylum, or excuse me, the order Ephemeroptera. And they're named that because their adult form in some species is very ephemeral or very short-lived. Literally, some species of mayflies, the juvenile, like this, will live in the water for sometimes for years, and then when they mature, they'll undergo a metamorphosis. The adult form will emerge, and they'll live for 2 hours, 3 hours, if that. And all they do is reproduce, and then they die. But some people will say, oh, mayflies only live for 2 hours. No, the adult form only lasts for 2 hours, but the juveniles can live for quite some time.
So Jason has shown you all of the cool stuff that he found. I think he's definitely the winner with numbers. There are a couple of things that I found that are different from Jason, and the first of which is one that he mentioned. I don't think those geese are happy with us. But this is a nice big mayfly. Again, Ephemeroptera. Don't live very long as adults, but can live for years as a juvenile. And here's quite a bit of a bigger one, and you can definitely see the 2 projections at the end. Circe, isn't it? Aren't they called?
Oh, right.
I don't remember. But that really helps you to differentiate between a mayfly and a damselfly larva. I'm a little disappointed we didn't find any dragonfly larvae today, But as far as predators go, we got something really, really cool to share with you. And this is something called a water scorpion. Water scorpions are good predators like the dragonflies and the damselflies are. This particular species, which is in the genus Renatra, is pretty common in Willow Lake, and so I was really happy to find one. And these walk around on the bottom and are predatory on the mayflies and the damselfly larvae and any other critters like that that they can catch. One other thing I got that was different from Jason is this critter right here. Whoops, I got a water boatman in there with him. This little critter right here, you've probably seen the terrestrial or the land relatives of this one. They're called roly-polies. This is an upside down isopod. He's not cooperating very well. There we go. Just walked right into my spoon. So this is an aquatic isopod, very similar to the roly-polies that you would find rolling over a log on the land. These, however, are completely aquatic. So you would not expect to find the terrestrials in the water, and if you took this aquatic one out and put it on the land, this would eventually die. So one important thing to remember is we encourage you to get out into ponds, roll over logs, look for critters. Boy, there's not a whole lot of other things that are cheap fun like this. But when you're done, please make sure that you return the critters where you got them from so they can grow big and make more. So the next type of organism we want to sample is called plankton. Plankton represents very small organisms that are going to be living in the water. Now we've talked about, or we will be talking about, zooplankton, which are the animal-like critters that are going to be in the water. We also find phytoplankton, or algae, that are living in the water, and there's a whole ecosystem based on these tiny little critters. This little net we see is the device that we use for sampling plankton. But rule number one for using a plankton net, make sure you've got a good handle on the end of the rope here, because if you throw the net and the net goes into the water, somebody's got to go get it, and guess what? It's not going to be me. Okay? So this net contains very fine holes and a container on the bottom. So really all we're doing is throwing the net, giving it a moment to sink down, and then just pulling it through the water column. And as we're doing this, we have the potential to be sampling thousands and millions of these little critters. And generally when you're throwing a plankton net, you want to be repeating this multiple times. And hopefully we'll see some good stuff that we'll be able to show you a little later.
Under the microscope, we see a mix of zooplankton called copepods and Cladocera. You can see a copepod right here, and I'll put up a bigger picture here showing you what these critters look like. These organisms propel themselves through the water using antennae. They primarily eat algae, although there are a few predatory individuals. They do move fast. Now, in addition to the copepods, in another picture here, we're going to see Cladocera. Both copepods and Cladocera are crustaceans, so they're arthropods. These particular critters have two shells, and they also propel themselves through the water using their antenna. There are some species that eat primarily algae. Many of these are predatory on other zooplankton.
So this isn't the ideal way to be minnow seining, but when one person has to work the camera and we only have one seiner, this is how we do it. Go ahead. So what Jason is doing is he's advancing the net through the water, and hopefully any fish that are there are going to get trapped in the net, and if they're fast enough to try to swim away, he's going to try to trap them in between the shore and the net. And he's straining pretty hard, so he must have some fish in there.
I think I have a big stick in there. But I have fish.
All right. Let's see what Jason caught.
I saw the one, just the one. So we have here a bluegill, which is a type of sunfish. So a very common fish in our area. There's a number of different sunfish species that are native to Illinois. Bluegill is probably the most common. One of the ways that you can identify a bluegill is this black spot here at the end of the dorsal fin. They also obviously have a little bit of blue on their gill, but a lot of the sunfish actually have that. So, kind of a fun find.
Let's see if we can pull the net a couple more times and catch anything else.
Yeah, there's got to be more in here. Let's see what else we can catch. Okay, so Bob and I took a couple more passes with the seine. We were a little bit more successful. We've got a few fish. Let me show them to you as I'm letting them go. Of course, they don't know I'm trying to let them go, and so they're trying to fight with me. We've got a lot of juvenile sunfish. These are almost definitely bluegill. But it can be really tough to tell with sunfish that are this small. Some of them are a little bit bigger. Definitely bluegill. There's only maybe 3 sunfish species that are found in Lake County. Bluegill is one, pumpkin seed is another, and pumpkin seeds look very different, so this is definitely not that.
Some geese that aren't happy with us being close to their nest.
Okay, I was trying to get 2 at once, but they were not letting me. When you're handling fish, it's always a good idea for your hands to be wet because fish secrete a mucus coating outside of their skin and scales. It's called their slime coat. It's a really fancy term for it. And it protects the fish. And if your skin is dry, you'll actually wipe a lot of that off, which leaves the fish exposed to pathogens, and it can harm the fish. So get your hands wet before you're going to touch fish. All right, this is the big one we caught. Again, this is a bluegill, which is a type of sunfish. And I always use bluegill as an example for my students when we're talking about evolution by selection. And if you've, okay, he's gone already. He's right there. If you've covered selection already, you'll know, and if you do it later on in the semester, you'll find out that selection is all about survival of the fittest. The trait with the highest fitness becomes more common over time. And it's a common misconception that fitness is, who's stronger, who's faster, who's bigger. It's not always the biggest and the fastest. Fitness is based on the number of surviving offspring. So sometimes the smallest or the sneakiest is actually going to produce the most offspring. And bluegill are a great example of this because there's 2 different types of males. There are big, strong males that build nests. They clear an area on the bottom of the pond, and then they entice females to come lay their eggs in the nest. Females lay the eggs. The male fertilizes the eggs, and then the female leaves, and this is actually a species where the male guards the eggs, and then when they hatch, he guards the fry for a period of time. But there's another type of male called sneaker males. The sneaker males are smaller. They actually are the same size as the females, and they have the same coloration as the females. And the sneaker males hang around the nests of the bigger nest-building males, and when the females come in to spawn, the sneaker males come in with them. they pretend they're a female, and when the female releases her eggs, the sneaker male also releases his sperm and fertilizes a bunch of the eggs. Then he leaves, and the nest builder stays behind, defends the nest, protects the young, a lot of which aren't even his. They're the other males. So the sneaker males, they're not big, they're not strong, they don't even care for the young, but they produce a lot of surviving offspring. So fitness is not always the biggest and the strongest. All right, and what we have left are a couple of largemouth bass. Here's the small one. You can see a lot of spots on him, fairly largemouth. These are a predator, and these are maybe the most popular sport fish in the world. There might be some challengers to that. These are native to eastern North America, but they've been spread all over the world. I actually have a friend from when I taught in China a few years ago. Her and her husband actually, there's lakes in China that are full of largemouth bass, and they just opened a store selling equipment to fish for largemouth bass. So these are a local species that has been very successful and has been spread all over the world because people love to catch them. And Bob and I were very excited to catch them today too. I'm not gonna lie. There you go, buddy. Grow bigger. Maybe I'll see you again next year. So that was the Pond Lab. I hope you found that interesting. Just to recap a few of the things that we learned today. A pond is a type of wetland ecosystem. Wetlands, remember, have standing water for at least part of the year. Ponds have standing water all of the year. They have hydric soil and they have hydrophytes, plants growing in them that like to grow in hydric soil. Pond is below a certain size, so usually about less than 10 acres we would consider a pond. Greater than 10 acres would be a lake.
Okay. And what we were doing today was biological assessment. So in order to find out how healthy a pond or a lake is, in addition to testing the chemicals, you go out there and check the critters. And if you're finding organisms that cannot tolerate low oxygen levels, if you're finding organisms that cannot tolerate high pollution levels, chances are you've got a pretty healthy wetland ecosystem there that's good for people, it's good for the organisms.
You know, Bob, this was really fun. I really enjoyed this, and I think this was the perfect thing to do on the 50th Earth Day.
I agree. So if you get a chance, we'd encourage you to go out to a pond or a lake or some other wetland and roll over some logs on the side, start looking for some critters. It's a great way to enjoy the aquatic habitats here in Lake County.
We have lots of them.
Take care.